Is the microphone working now? Now, the truth is I don't need a microphone in this room at all. Oh, no, I don't. The microphone is because we're recording everything as we did last year. But this year I hope we can manage to record things successfully. And our technical volunteers, Mark, Mike, and our contractors have spent a good deal of time and quite some money on making sure that the microphones do work. So please God, just cross your fingers and pray. A couple of things. First of all, welcome. Do sit down and stop talking, Jack Jang. A couple of things first. Would you just raise your hand if you've not been to this building before? So there's still... Right. So, Claudio, ask someone for a little tour later on and we'll show you around the building. So, those of you who have been to the building before will know we've got cracked sinks. If you've looked in our bathrooms, you'll see the sinks are all cracked, and people keep saying to me, why didn't you replace the sinks? And the reason is because they're heritage listed, and we have to have cracked sinks. It was a condition. It was one of the conditions of the planning consent. So that's a little explanation for you. I've also got to make a couple of apologies. The first is that my computer broke down a week ago, and I was supposed to send out dinner menus, and my computer's been away at the menders. In fact, it's not come back. They sent me a new one. It was that bad. So I've got to deal with dinner. So if you're coming to the dinner, even if you didn't tell me earlier you were coming to the dinner, will you please raise your hand, and Nicola will give you a menu. You have to accept this as sort of a physical form of email. Or rather, it's sort of N-mail, Nicola mail. And on the back of this is my bank details. If you want to pay me by bank transfer, please do. If you want to pay me in cash, please do sometime before lunch. And if you don't want to pay me, you can't come to dinner. So. It's okay, I'll trust you. Good. Yes? No, it's tomorrow. Yeah. It's always on the second day of the Crawford Festival. It's a long-established tradition. So we're doing quite well here. I'm taking a pause because it's very difficult to ask people to do two things at once. Today, ideally before lunch. Does anybody else need a dinner fork? That's all I need now is your dinner money. Okay, my second apology is that one of the things we wanted very much to do was to have somebody talk about European early journals. And for various reasons, best laid plans, all of the speakers who were really good bets for doing this were not available, so we're going to have to do that on another occasion. We have a treat in store, which is Dan Piazza, who's going to talk about the American early journals. And I'll come back to Dan in a moment. But I wanted to introduce you to something. Those of you who have looked at the catalogue and looked at my introduction will see that I've written about this magazine, the Magazin Pittoresque, from 1862. And this, in my opinion, and in my experience, is the first magazine ever to illustrate postage stamps in 1862. If anybody knows of an earlier one, I'd love to hear from you. But this, I think, in 78 or so articles illustrated pretty much every postage stamp that was available in 1862. It's a wonderful thing. If you would like to have a look at it, I'll show you later on. But these early European journals were absolutely phenomenal. And this one is Briefmarken Journal 1884, one of the very earliest color illustrated journals. The Americans produced a color in the 1870s, I think, but I haven't been able to buy one of those yet. And then, of course, there's this wonderful journal, The Philatelist. This is Philatelist Volume 5, Pemberton's journal. And this is the first with the Spud papers, where they glued in forgeries. And also a wonderful and very difficult series of journals to get. I didn't ask Nicola if I could borrow the stuff from the library downstairs because you know what librarians are like. They're a tiny bit possessive about, well, no, they're very cautious in how their material is handled, but this is my material. So if you'd like to look at a few of these early journals, please ask. Nicola, have I got any more housekeeping to do? Good. So, Dan, I'm going to introduce Dan Piazza. Dan Piazza, Smithsonian Chief Curator, responsible for 6 million artifacts or 6 million postage stamps. It's one of the reasons he never answers his emails, because he's so busy counting his artifacts. We were absolutely terrified that Dan wasn't going to come, but Dan is a legend for not answering emails. And I'm very pleased that he made it here yesterday, because I was having kittens on Friday last week and Thursday last week when we weren't quite sure what was going on. But Dan is one of Lynn's magazine's most influential philatelists. He's a speaker at many philatelic events. He's been at the Smithsonian now for 16 years. He's thinking of staying. And we're very, very lucky that Dan, very grateful to Dan for coming to talk to us today about early journals and smaller journals in the United States from the beginning. So lastly, thank you so much for coming. That's for you, Dan. Thank you so much for coming. I'm very grateful to see you all here today, and I hope we have a really interesting second Crawford Festival. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for inviting me, and to everyone who's organized this conference. And they're getting their revenge on me this morning by making the guy with jet lag start off the program. So that's what that's right. That's one way to do it. Okay. So the topic of my talk this morning is the big history of small journals. And I guess the first thing to do is to talk a little bit about definitions and what that means, because I think that's always been one of the challenges of dealing with some of the early philatelic journals, at least in an American context. They were very short-lived and very ephemeral, and as a result, they also contained a lot of advertising. Some of them were entirely consisted of advertising, with little or no editorial content at all. And if they did have editorial content, it was almost as likely that that content was pirated from somewhere else than that it was original or genuine. And so as a result, many of these things were not considered important by early collectors. They weren't archived and found, or archived and collected. And so they're very difficult to find today. It's hard to consult them in any sort of critical mass in order to be able to analyze them and draw any conclusions about them. They were also ephemeral because they were physically very delicate. They're often printed on very light and fragile paper for reasons that I'll explain in a few moments. So they're incredibly rare. And in order to analyze them and draw any conclusions about them, you really have to sort of gather them together, and it's very difficult to do. At the Smithsonian National Postal Museum Library, however, we have an extremely large collection of these, and that is due to a bequest in the late 1970s and early 1980s by one of my predecessors as curator of philately, a man named George Townsend Turner. Turner was certainly in the United States the foremost philatelic bibliophile of the 20th century, probably in the world. And his personal library he really started collecting philatelic literature in a sustained way about 1939. And over the years, he acquired the libraries of Ralph Kimball and William C. Ricketts and William Stone. So all of the greatest examples of the philatelic libraries built by the earliest generation of collectors all sort of found, and Hiram Dietz's collection found its way to Turner, and Ricketts through Dietz also made its way to Turner's collection. So when George Turner died in 1979, he had the largest philatelic library probably in the world in private hands. Turner lived in Washington, D.C. His house was on A Street behind the Supreme Court and the Library of Congress, just about a quarter of a mile from where the National Postal Museum is today. And his library was brought to the Smithsonian one trunkful at a time, in the trunk of a car. First to the National Museum of American History on the Mall, and then it was moved to the National Postal Museum when the Postal Museum opened in 1993. And so it's through the Turner collection that we really have a large collection of these small journals. And one of the other difficulties in describing and analyzing these publications is that previous writers have used all sorts of different terms to describe them. The Smithsonian uses the term small journals. I'll be honest with you, I don't know why. I don't know where that term comes from. It may be a library science term because this collection resides in the library collection and not in the museum collection. They've also been called short-lived journals, advertising journals, ephemeral journals. So the terminology, the definitions of what they are has changed over the years. This is a photograph of the National Postal Museum Library. And then these are the vertical files that contain the small journals collection. And this is just one side of it. So there's an identical set of file cabinets back to back with this. And on the front side where I'm showing you, I pulled out some drawers and took some photos. Those are the U.S. journals, and on the other small journals. And on the other side are the European, including the Great Britain journals. And then this is just a view of some of the folders. These are just the folders with titles that begin New England to New York titles. So this is just one half of one drawer. And you may be able to see green highlighter markings on the sides of some of these folders. And that is because the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives has undertaken a number of projects recently to conserve this collection and catalog it and make the cataloging data available online through the Smithsonian website, which I'll show you how to access in a moment. And then hopefully this is a prelude also to digitizing some of the collection. And so the folders that have green highlighter marks on them are the ones that have already been cataloged and are able to be found in the online card catalog. And this is how you find them in the online card catalog. You go to cirrus-libraries.si.edu. Then you go on the search tab, and you click number. You see number highlighted in yellow. Search local call numbers and use the term SJU, and that's the shorthand for the small journals. And then that will return the list of, at this point, thousands of titles in the small journals collection. So that's just sort of an overview of what these journals are, what the Smithsonian collection has regarding them, and how you can find them online. Okay, so then what's the importance of them and what do they mean? And I think the way that philatelic historians have thought about these journals has changed quite a lot, especially in the last 20 to 30 years. Only about 30 years ago, in 1992, in the book Philatelic Literature, Manfred Amrein wrote this about them. There are a multitude of ephemeral, more or less worthless philatelic papers published during the incunabula period. Hastily created philatelic periodicals that came and went without glory. Okay, so that's a pretty damning assessment of these journals, and not entirely incorrect. But just about 20 years after that, Wolfgang Maassen and Vincent Schuberex have written that they are of lasting value from the point of view of philatelic history, as well as the history of stamp dealing, the philatelic trade, the market, and its development. And I would add to that from some of these early journals, even though they're highly commercial and mostly consist of advertisements, we can also tease out some significant details about what was fashionable to collect in the late 19th century, what was available in quantity or selling for high prices that is now scarce today. You can find quite a bit of this, and that's often a clue to some less than ethical dealing going on. And these journals also are some of the only publications that preserve the names of some of the early philatelists and dealers that don't appear in any other source. And so there's been a reappraisal, I think, of the significance of these early short-lived journals because of what they can tell us about the early days of philately. All right, fine. What I want to suggest this morning is kind of argue in the opposite direction and say not what can these journals tell us about philately, but what can other disciplines tell us, and how can we analyze these journals using some other data to get a sense of how they came about in the first place. What were the conditions that enabled their creation, and why did they flourish? Because they did flourish tremendously. So in the earlier slide, Amrein talks about the philatelic incunabula period. And people generally date this period as ending somewhere around 1879 or 1880. So you're talking about the first 15 years, roughly, of philatelic publishing, the cradle period. And those are a number of the journals that Chris just showed and talked about. And the philatelic scholarship and the level of philatelic publishing in that incunabula period in the United States and also in Europe was actually quite high. What we're talking about here this morning are some of the journals that came after that, in the period roughly 1880 to 1900. There's a tremendous explosion of these journals. A number of them publish only a handful of numbers. Many of them only publish one or two numbers before they go out of existence. And the numbers of them that are put out into the marketplace increase exponentially. So why? What's going on at the time that can help us not necessarily understand more about early philately, but understand more about these journals and where they came from? And we have to look at two things, I think. In a U.S. context, and maybe it's similar in a European and a British context as well, I think the sudden appearance of these journals in the 1880s has a lot to do with changing U.S. postal legislation. It's in the middle of the United States Civil War that the system of 4 classes of mail. Well, actually, at that time, 3 classes of mail, and then the 4th class was added later on, 4th class mail being essentially books. But the categorization and the legislation that established 3 classes of U.S. mail is passed in 1863. 2nd class mail, which is periodical mail, is created at this time, and the postage rate then is set at 1 cent per ounce. And then in 1875, the postage rate on 2nd class mail is set at 3 cents per pound. That's a 4/5 reduction in the cost of periodicals postage. And then that's lowered again in 1879 to 2 cents per pound, and lowered again in 1885 to 1 cent per pound. So what's going on here? In the public service mission of the United States Post Office Department, from the founding of the country, really, one of the goals of the Post Office Department had been to enable the circulation of pamphlets and newspapers, the transmission of news and ideas through the mail. And that's what Congress is, and it's Congress who sets postal rates in this period. That's what Congress is intending to do by setting these postage rates so low for newspapers and periodicals between the 1860s and the 1880s, is to enable the spread of idea and news through the mail system. Okay, a little bit later on, what I'm going to want to suggest to you is how some philatelic dealers, particularly in the early period, saw this as an opportunity to use this legislation that's intended for public affairs and public service to send their advertising and their price lists through the mail. So on one hand, we've got extremely favorable postage rates for periodicals in this period. And this 1 cent per pound rate for newspapers and periodicals persists in the United States until after the First World War. So it lasts a very, very long time. And we have contemporary evidence from newspapers and other reports also that in many cases, even this minimal postage rate of 1 cent per pound was not collected by postal administrations, postal officials in the post offices. So it seems that in many cases they were actually getting free postage through the mail. There are congressional hearings about this in the 1880s and 90s. Okay, so on one hand we've got favorable postal conditions for sending these things out through the mail. On the other hand, in the years after the American Civil War, we experience what I like to think of as the first desktop publishing revolution. And this is related to the Civil War, in the United States anyway. A number of manufacturers go into business during the Civil War, producing for the first time small, light, portable printing presses. And they are used for field headquarter operations in the Civil War to print casualty lists, to print daily orders, to print operational reports, whole host of things, pay vouchers, all sorts of things. These field printing presses are designed to meet the needs of the Union Army in particular in the field during the Civil War. Here's an example of one from circa 1861. This is in the collection of the National Museum of American History on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., also a Smithsonian Institution museum. And this looks very much like just a very small, scaled-down version of the sort of big iron printing presses that you might see in a more permanent job printing shop, with a tympan that folds over and a crank and a type bed in which you'd set your movable type. And then later in the war, presses are simplified even further to remove the tympan entirely, and you simply put your typeset form in the printing bed on the bottom, lay the paper on top of it, and crank the roller over the top of the paper to make the impression that way. So these are now these presses are designed to be portable. They're designed to be operated by a single operator. You no longer need a whole job printing establishment with a master printer and apprentices and a cabinet of type and all sorts of accessories. This is very basic, rough and ready field printing that's going on here. And these presses are developed and marketed toward the Army during the Civil War, but after the war, they remained popular. People who had experienced and used and operated them during the war began to see all sorts of commercial applications for them. And if we look in printing journals of this period, journals like the Typographer and the American Stationer, they're filled during this period with laments by job printers, of all of these amateur printers who think they can just sort of, with a cheap little press and some type, they think they can just set themselves up in business and produce these sort of slipshod, poorly printed things that then are out there competing with, the real craftsmanship of job printing. And these presses, during the Civil War and in the first few years after the Civil War, they're fairly expensive. You'd pay the equivalent today of about $600 to $1,300 for one of these printing presses during and in the years just after the Civil War. But then a new generation of presses is developed after the war, primarily in the 1870s, and these are of a very different type. These are what are popularly called, and what are called in the letterpress enthusiast community, clamshell presses. These aren't horizontal, these are now vertical. They take up even less room. Just put it on top of a bookcase or a small table. Instead of being flat, the print bed is now vertical. And this particular version, you'll see, has no inking roller or plates. So these, in this case, the type would still have to be inked by hand. But they're lever operated rather than roller or crank operated. They're cast iron. And so this is an early, circa 1880 secretary press, as it was called, made by the Young America Company. This is also from the National Museum of American History collection. But probably the most successful press of the period was made by the Kelsey Company of Meriden, Connecticut. And these printing presses came in generally a couple of standard sizes, 3x5, 5x8, and 7x10, or occasionally some companies made 8x12 printing beds. And this, if you've ever seen any of these small journals, they are usually roughly that size, 5x8. I think a lot of them were actually printed on these tabletop printing presses rather than actually contracted out to a job printer, because job printers are expensive. You've got the printer, you've got his apprentices who all have to be paid. You've got all the sort of overhead costs of running a print shop. But in journals of the time too, one of the things that everyday shopkeepers, merchants, grocers, druggists all complain about difficulties in getting their billheads and their stationery and their corner cards printed, because those were fairly small run jobs, and so you'd get bumped all the time when the printer had a really lucrative high print run, very expensive job. Your invoices and your billheads, they would sort of get put to the side. So these things are marketed directly at this sort of these two classes, at merchants and grocers and other people who want to be able to do their own small run print shop runs for their own work. But then in 1876, at the Philadelphia Centennial International Exhibition in Philadelphia, in the Machinery Hall, this is the east front of the Machinery Hall, a number of these small tabletop printing presses are put on display for the first time and marketed not just to the trade, so to speak, but to the general public. And this is where you get the sort of second class of users of these printing presses, and these tend to be hobbyists and enthusiasts, and a number of them, I think, are philatelists. I say this for a couple of reasons. One is that we know from marketing and trade material of the time that a lot of these printing presses are aimed at just that same demographic that philately is aimed at, right? 8 to 10 to 12-year-old boys in the 19th century. But also, they did a lot of the advertising of these presses in kids' magazines like St. Nicholas and Youth's Companion, which I think not coincidentally also carried a lot of the early philatelic articles. So these printing presses are being advertised in general interest publications that have a lot of philatelic content. So you've got some youthful exuberance in the buying of these presses. And they've become much more affordable since the Civil War. The Kelsey Press in 1876, we'll go back to the Kelsey Press, that sells for about $6 in 1876. And that particular model, that model of printing press, this one is actually from the 1940s. It's patented in 1874 is when the patent is taken out. And this printing press remains in production in Connecticut from the 1870s until the 1990s with almost no change except different metals. It goes, at some point, they switch from cast iron to being sort of lighter aluminum metal, but otherwise it's the same basic design that's in production for almost 120 years. Literally tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of these presses are sold. You could still go on eBay and buy one of these for a couple $100, one of these Kelsey presses. And so it's a desktop publishing revolution aimed first at the Army, and then interestingly enough, then at the trade, and then at children. But I think really a number of hobbyists and other enthusiasts start to pick up on it as well during this period. And these are some of the advertisements from the 1860s. Economy, every man his own printer, portable printing and letter copying press. And you can see how, with a little on the left, how these things were intended to be used, just in the corner of a shop or even at home. These were marketed to the home market as well in the 1870s and 80s, just on top of a cabinet that would hold a few basic supplies and type. As early as 1835, Alexis de Tocqueville, in his tour through America, wrote this. He said, "Nothing is easier than to set up a newspaper, as a small number of subscribers suffices to defray the expenses." What was he talking about there, and what did he mean? He meant that in the United States, there was virtually no startup cost to being a newspaper or journal publisher. There's no regulation or licensing of publishers. There's no fee for registering with the post office, and no real formality. You just have to print your publication and put it in the mail and send it out as a newsletter and periodical. That was the case. He observed that as early as the 1830s. It was certainly the case during this period, the 1880 to 1900 that I've been talking about with the proliferation of philatelic journals, and it's still the case today for the most part in the United States. And so what is all of this kind of coming towards or adding up to? The traditional interpretation of these journals, which I talked about a little bit at the beginning of my talk, is that they were short-lived either because they were the product of exuberance and optimism and they couldn't possibly last, so they just print one or two numbers and go out of business, or they were a failed venture of some kind. This is how they're talked about in the literature. I want to suggest that's probably true for many of them, but I want to suggest that there's a third explanation, especially for these advertising journals. Maassen and Schuberex, in their 2013 book, talk quite a bit about how one of the functions that the advertising journals in this period served was that the respectable philatelic journals of the period were, the word they used was neurotic about advertising, and tried very hard to keep advertising out of the respectable philatelic journals. And so this was kind of an outlet for that. Okay, fine. I think what the case is with a number of these journals is that they were never intended to be, particularly these advertising in these dealer price list journals, so they were never intended to be more than one or two number publications or productions. I think what's going on here is the combination of cheap postage, the new availability of home printing presses, brought forth hundreds of these journals, and some were produced by clubs, some were produced by individual collectors as an adjunct or an extension of their hobby activities. But I think what's going on with some of them, especially the advertising ones, is that enterprising stamp dealers see an opportunity. They see an opportunity to take their price list, give it a title, put a masthead on it, because there's no regulation of this thing. You just put a title on your journal and say, Volume 1, Number 1, and presto. You're a newspaper, you're a periodical, and now you can mail out your price lists at 1 cent per pound instead of mailing them out at the circular or the regular letter rate of the period. And in many cases, as I mentioned earlier, we know from the philatelic literature that there's no postage at all in some cases because the collecting of the periodical and newspaper postage rate seems to have been very haphazard in this period. So I think I just want to add to the interpretation that's already been offered that there's a third interpretation and put some of the production of some of these early journals into context. What were the technological and the postal changes that enabled them? And to suggest that at least in some cases, what's going on here is dealers taking advantage of a loophole in the periodical press in the United States anyway. This is what's going on in the US in order to send out their price lists and their advertising disguised as a periodical. Just a bibliography of some references for anyone who's interested. I don't know what the format is, if you want to take questions now or take questions later, or we'll take questions later. I planned for 30 minutes. That's 30 minutes. Do I move this on to someone else's slides? Oh, okay.
Where's the mic?
I'll stand here, okay. Got you. Okay. They're color-coded.
These are the ones who, for people who'd like to ask questions. And Nick's got one as well. Is it on, Nick? Fantastic. Got enough. Excellent. So, you'd like to ask Dan some questions?
Okay. Dan, thank you for your presentation. I want to ask a question about one of your early slides,
Okay.
where you talked about the reduction in postal rates.
Right.
That's the one. What's the significance of the stamp which is on the left, which says $100? What is that, and why was it in use?
So the philatelic expression of these new classes of mail and the introduction of the newspaper and periodical rates is the introduction of the newspaper and periodical stamps in the United States, which the first issue comes out in 1865, and they're the very large 3 values. This is, I think, from the 1885 issue. And these are, so the U.S. newspaper stamps are, unlike the newspaper stamps issued in a lot of other countries, which are intended to be placed directly on the newspaper postage, that was never really done in the United States. These were, so the reason you get high denominations like $100 and $500 and things like that is that these were an accounting device. These were kept in ledgers by the publisher and in some cases also at the post office, simply to show that the postage had been paid. So the newspapers and the periodicals would pass through the mail with no postage stamps and generally no marking of any kind other than an address on the periodical itself. And the accounting of the postage due was kept in ledgers. So, and you'd pay quarterly. So if you're a publisher sending out your mailing, you know, at the 1 cent per pound rate, you know, if you're if you're publishing daily or weekly, and the rates were somewhat different if you were a weekly or a monthly and so forth. But that would all be sort of tallied up, and you'd pay quarterly. So that's why you get the high face values and the high denominations on some of these.
Thank you.
Yeah. That's always the people say, well, how come we never find these used and we never find them, and why such high face values and that sort of thing? They were not really intended to be out in the to circulate in the mail stream. They were administrative and accounting devices.
I was wondering,
Yes.
what sort of circulation would it be practicable to produce on these sort of presses, and what sort of circulations did some of the publishers claim?
That's a statistical analysis that, the second part of that, what sort of circulation did they claim? That's a statistical analysis that I haven't done. So I'm not entirely sure about that. I have operated some of these types of printing presses. You know, the format of most of these journals is sort of 5x8, 2-column, 4 pages. So, I mean, I think these could be printed, could be typeset and printed fairly rapidly and fairly quickly without a lot of, without a lot of training. When I say that they were poorly printed, a lot of the art of printing, whether it's a big flatbed press or a small tabletop sort of clamshell press like this, is not so much setting the type and inking in the paper. I mean, just about anybody can do that. It's the packing, it's the making sure all of your type is level so that everything prints, everything makes contact with the paper and prints, and your letters don't slip in the form and that sort of a thing. And you see, when I look at these journals, in our small journal collection, I see a lot of that. I see a lot of high type, I see a lot of low type, I see a lot of letters slipping. Many of these things, it's pretty obvious they're not printed by professional printers. So that's one of the reasons why I think some of the things you would look for, if you were doing an evaluation of these, to get a sense of whether this might be being printed by the dealer themselves or someone in their family or someone without a lot of experience in operating a printing press, large or small, is you'd be looking for those sorts of characteristics. But once the type is, set, that's the longest part of the process. And if they're printing 100 or 200 copies or something like this, I mean, you could do it all in a day. You could set the type and print 100 copies, certainly on a tabletop press like this in a day. Yes?
Yes, thank you. Looking at that particular slide,
Yes.
that my father taught art in a school, and we had a big publisher of academic journals in the town, and so he started teaching printing to the students. And I can remember the first printing press I ever saw was a slightly larger British built, British made press of that sort, and he had one also, a second one, about that size. So it brings back memories of about 60 to 70 years ago.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. But my question is more about the market for the journals. I don't know whether either in this country or the United States there has been any systematic study of the development of stamp collecting in the sense of clubs being formed, because in order to mail these out, they must have had address lists. Right. And you and well, today you can buy legally or illegally address lists. And I just was struck. A friend of mine has done a fascinating book on the growth of golf clubs in the UK from the essentially 1870s through, looking at the nature of the membership and so on, and it's quite different, the data that he's come up with, from what people might have expected. I wonder whether anything similar has been done to your knowledge, about the growth of stamp collecting and hence the market and where they would have got names and addresses from, for example?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think they are, to some extent, getting them from the clubs, from their own customers. There's also, I guess, the factor that in the 1870s, your address didn't have to be nearly as precise as it does today, you know, for your mail piece to be delivered, and so a name in a city was often enough. And I believe it's in Wolfgang and Vincent's book from 2013, where they talk about several examples of journals that they've seen where it has a statement in it along the lines of, you know, we're sending you this complimentary inaugural initial of our journal, and if you don't send it back to us, then you'll keep receiving it. So, you know, sort of a thing. And so, you know, it's I think that's a level of statistical analysis that it's really hard to get at. How many of these things were actually delivered? How many of them, you know, where are the names and the addresses coming from? To what extent are they being shared? And there has been work done on mail order in this period and the growth of mail order. There's some scholarship on it. And so maybe also philatelists need to look at some of that collateral material, the growth of mail order and catalogs and subscription lists through the mail, to kind of understand how some of these things were done. But the first half of your comment I wanted to mention, also just I wanted to point out that, yeah, these things look very sort of exotic and antique today, but they were very common in the 19th and early 20th century. So yeah. So hobbyists, universities using them, people, and there's been something of a revival. Letterpress printing has become something of a hobby. Now these things turn up on eBay for hundreds of dollars sometimes, these presses, if the rollers are in good condition and everything is rust-free and all that sort of stuff. So these things were produced in the tens of thousands and are still available in the market today. So they were clearly ubiquitous. A lot of people had access to them. And it was, as I say, it was sort of the first desktop publishing revolution of the 19th century. The second one being the introduction of desktop publishing on computers, you know, really in the 1980s. There were a couple of other hands, but the microphone has to make its way around. Yes?
Thank you, Dan, for a most interesting talk. Two things. One, if you want to see this sort of Excelsior printing presses and lots of others going through recess printing and lithography and letterpress printing of this type, the Amberley Museum in Sussex is the place to go. It's a wonderful museum, and I do recommend it to you. You can get there by train, and it's a very, very interesting place to visit. Secondly, and this really follows on from Roger's idea, surely the number of documents which you have preserved, and I don't think you really told us how many you've got, but it seems to me that this would be a very good gauge of the number of collectors that there might have been in the States during that period. I'm always fascinated by the number of stamp collectors, or philatelists, call it what you like, who are available to become members of the Royal Philatelic Society London. And I think we're only scratching the surface. But I would be very interested to know if there's been any research as to the number of collectors actually physically collecting stamps, say in 1875.
No, I mean, not that I've seen that type of work has been done, but I think, you know, and they're in the process. They've just about finished cataloging the U.S. collection, and we'll go on to the GB and worldwide collection as time and funds allow. But I think that's one of the things of making this stuff available, and cataloging it and getting it online, is the uses that it could be put to, I think, are endless. Figuring out how many collectors there were in the 19th century, figuring out how many copies, at least statistically, these dealers are claiming to be sending out of these advertising journals. To what extent is there overlap? I mean, are they the same people advertise? To what extent is there, from the titles and from the places of publication, can we get a sense of how regional or local philately was in the late 19th century, and hotspots, hotbeds of philately? You know, is New England a hotbed? Is the Middle West a hotbed? And from the publication places of these things, I think you could do that. The real challenge, as I say, with all of them, is that they are so ephemeral, so few of them survive, that really the advantage of having a huge collection, like the Turner collection at the Smithsonian, is that at that level, this type of analysis and these statistical questions, can be answered. And I'm sure all sorts of questions that I haven't even thought to interrogate this material about, could be researched. Yeah.
Jürgen had a question.
Thank you for pointing out the relation between the postage rate and the success of these journals. I guess this is good food for thought for today. German Post has skipped all the reduced rates for printed papers unless one had very large volumes. So we, for example, in our local club issue about 250 copies per issue, but this does not, this has to be sent at full postage rate. And as we have about 1/3 of members who do not access internet things, who possibly do not have even an email registered with our club, so we still feel bound to mail out printed journals to reach all our membership. So I think that's good food for thought on the future of the periodicals, given that the fortunate cases in the posting do not exist anymore. What does this mean? How should we behave? How should our periodicals should evolve? So thank you for this piece of food for thought.
Oh, sure. The other thing that comes to mind in that regard, and I'm sorry, the term is not coming to me at the moment, but there is a sort of advertising and marketing term for, even though something is purchased online or the transaction is consummated online, that is often the result of having received a printed catalog or document. And so I think the line between online actions and receiving something printed in the mail is not as cut and dried as maybe we believed sort of early on. So, you get credit for that's e-commerce, but really, and I know this, I do this myself all the time. A catalog comes, I don't fill out the order form and send it back. I go online and I buy the thing. And so how do you look at published and printed journals as then having calls to action that are online or prompting some type of interaction or something that you want to happen online, but the physical, tangible reminder, in a sense, is the publication that comes. And there's an advertising or marketing term for that, and it's not coming to me at the moment. But looking at some of that, so one of the things I've, in a roundabout way, tried to suggest here is how philatelists can look at some things, like in this case, the history of printing technologies and other fields to get more insight into the history of our own field. That the field of mail order marketing, there's been a lot written about it, particularly in this period, in the last quarter of the 19th century. And there's a lot online about it now in a modern context. And so looking at some of that marketing and advertising literature and seeing how people are using the mail in order to prompt actions online would be a way forward. Some of that too. Not seeing them as separate, but how to integrate the printed journal and the online virtual website and exhibition and so forth. looking at them a little more holistically, where I think maybe for the last 15 or 20 years, we've been sort of trained to think about one is dying and the other is growing. And no, I think they're part of a ecosystem. They were in the 19th century, and I think they are today too. Oh, yes, sir. Now I'm being interrogated by the professor. I have to be on my toes, yes.
What a splendid introduction. I think you've opened up an excellent area of what I call context philately by expanding it into the printing methods. My understanding is that the first philatelic periodical in North America was published by Samuel Allen Taylor. He was clearly using a printing press somewhat like this. Do you think, or has any research been done into whether he was producing his stamps, his fakes, his college stamps, his stamps that didn't really exist, and then marketing them by using the same printing press to print the periodical, first from Canada, then from that rogues town of New York, to market his goodies?
That's a good question. I'm trying to remember a lot of the S. Allen Taylor forgeries. I could be misremembering, but I think a lot of them are lithographs. I don't think they're typeset like this. And so that, and that is a form of printing that does not really lend itself to amateur at-home creations. So in those cases, I think he must have been working with someone to create the stones and print them. But certainly in the case of, we never talk about it, and we talk about it only in hushed tones, but of course J.W. Scott, the father of American philately, was also a notorious forger. And the carriers and locals field in the United States, of course, was riddled through with fakes and forgeries until, I mean, boy, it's not until the 1980s or 90s that really people begin to figure out how to distinguish these things. And a lot of those early forgeries of early provisional type stamps, but also carrier and local stamps, in many cases the originals of those were printed on with movable type on flatbed or vertical printing presses like this. And so some of those forgeries could also have been created on presses like this. But in the case where they're lithographed, then I think really S. Allen Taylor had to be working with another printer. Incidentally, I mean, on the subject of context philately and Smithsonian Institution and philately and so forth, this is how the Smithsonian in the 1880s and 1890s gets into collecting stamps. First is historical relics of the American Revolution with the Stamp Act tax stamp of 1765, and then as historical relics of the Civil War. But then secondly, and for many, many years, the Smithsonian collects and interprets and displays its postage stamps. Anybody ever been to the philatelic displays when they were on the third floor of the American History Museum in Washington, D.C.? It was the stamps, the coins, and the printing presses. The printing presses are no longer on display, but that's why they still have them. And for many years in the Museum of History and Technology, that was how the Smithsonian collected and interpreted postage stamps, was not really as philately for its own sake, but as examples of graphic arts and printing, and of the sorts of things that would have been printed on the printing presses that were in the collection. So that was the context that the Smithsonian and a number of other museums put philately in, probably from I'd say from the 1920s through the 1950s or 60s, graphic arts and printing, rather than being a discipline in its own right or a science in its own right. That was how they interpreted it.
As I've got the microphone here, I'll ask a second question, sure. Pertinence, but I'll ask it. Do you believe that Mr. George Grinnell had one of these printing presses?
Oh. All I can say is that they were ubiquitous in this period. They were ubiquitous. They were cheap. They were plentiful. They were in schools had them. Churches had them to print the church bulletin. Schools had them to print little school newspapers and and also as to teach it, for trade purposes, to teach a trade. Clubs had them. They were ubiquitous. They were common. Anybody could have had one of these presses. Did I keep myself out of trouble with that answer? Anyone could have had one of these presses. It was not an art or mystery by this point. Okay. Yes. I have one. This lady's had the microphone for a while. Yes.
That's just Mark.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, I hope asking a rather basic question.
Sure.
I'm not the only one, but I've never seen the word. Is it incubellata?
Oh, incunabula. Yes.
Because
Yes.
the word incubate, that it's the beginning of.
Yes.
But I wondered specifically.
Yes.
Incuna.
So incunabula is a term.
Is it specifically relating to the beginning of the magazines or the beginning of developing philately? I wonder if you could.
Well, it's a term that comes from rare books originally, and it's generally the sort of different people put different dates on it, but it's generally the first 50 or 75 years of printed books in the rare book trade. That's how bibliophiles describe it. And so then that term got sort of expropriated into philately, and so people talk about the incunabula or the cradle period of philately being roughly that period from 1862 to about 1879 when clubs are starting to form and journals are starting to be published. And so, yeah, it's that early. I think the Latin root of the word is cradle, actually, I think is where the word comes from in Latin. But so, yeah, it's a term that's been imported from the rare book world into philately. I don't know exactly where or when it first got used in a philatelic context, but most books and studies that I've seen put the philatelic incunabula period as ending around 1879 or 1880, and then Amrine actually calls the period 1880 to 1900 post-incunabula philately, and then after 1900, I guess it's all just modern.
Mr. Google says that their books before. Sorry, Mr. Google, which I just looked up, says that their books printed before 1501.
Yeah. So that and Gutenberg's around 1450, right? So that's the first 50 or so years of the printed word. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
Yes, philatelic incunabula, not to be confused with incunabula. I think I owe, on behalf of everybody, a big thank you to you, because this was a really interesting. It's lifting the lid on something which most of us don't know anything about, and good also to remember George Turner, whose collecting has made the Smithsonian Library such an important resource. We have here the potential to study the history of the philatelic trade. Now, the philatelic trade is largely invisible in philatelic history. It's a huge subject. And one of the things that philatelic historians have been trying to do is to get hold of issues like this. I was talking this morning to David about P.J. Anderson, who set out to look for the first collector and the first publication. And he put his volume together with the Philatelic Literature Society in 1912, I think. So there's a whole history of our history which is hidden from history, and something which there are many years of research left to work this through, because much of our history is ephemeral. Yeah, absolutely. And you do get occasional histories of particular houses I mean, Curler did one recently. There have been others. There have been people we know do talks on the history of Stanley Gibbons, largely because if they printed it, they'd all be in trouble. And the other thing that this lifts the lid on is the philatelic Big Bang of probably the early 1880s, when all of a sudden it was a mass enterprise and not the preserve of a handful of aficionados, small numbers of collectors. So there's that element too. And to link Congress's will, if you like, to bind the continent through cheap postage to the history of printing technology and the history of small journals is pretty clever, Dan, actually. I think it's a very neat conceit, but actually very plausible as well, so thank you for that. We do have a small printing press here in a cabinet. Is it on this floor? Yeah, which is the Sperati press. And if you want to see one of these small presses, sadly not in action, but if you want to see one of these small presses, there's one just outside the door here, which we've had courtesy of, not Steve Wolski, his father, Carl Wolski, who donated it to us some years ago. The history also of clubs and societies is another piece of hidden philatelic history. You can barely get any national association, any national federation, to give you a list of their members 25 years ago, because the secretary died, his wife, partner, or significant other thought, thank God for that, I can now get rid of all this junk, and it went into the skip or into the recycling. So there's that enormous part of our history which is there for us to study, if only we can find ways of getting at it. And digitizing this material is one way to get at it in the United States. And while there are similarities between the United States and other places, all places are different in their histories. And so that history in Europe would be different. But a huge area for research, unsung, largely untouched, and a long way to go. Dan referred to Wolfgang Maassen and Vincent Skuberecht's book, which is an excellent book. But even they have a chapter on the trade, a chapter on clubs and societies. And they're just really a taster. There's a long, long way to go. And getting at the material and resources to allow us to study our own history is a challenge for the present and the future, a challenge which has not been raised in the past. Just one other little point. You talked about the Philadelphia exhibition. Some of the first philatelic exhibitions were not philatelic exhibitions, they were trade, art and commerce stands where stamps were displayed by companies like De La Rue and others at these great international trade exhibitions. Another area of philatelic history in terms of the production methods of postage stamps, the art, the graphic design, which are also completely untouched. You try and find catalogues of these great industrial exhibitions in London, in Paris, in Vienna, in Chicago, in Philadelphia, and other capital cities around the world. And there's a whole history there of our history, which is untouched, unsung, and unheralded. So, Dan, thank you so much for lifting the lid on something which is daunting, to consider how we continue to research our philatelic history. I think this was a wonderful beginning to this.
It's been my pleasure, and these are the thoughts I'm able to have when I'm not answering emails.
And they're thoughts you could share if you did answer them. So, thank you for raising more questions than you've answered. And that is a splendid beginning. Now, we have David in 35 minutes. And I think we should, can we, is Nicola there? Can we have a little break? Right, half an hour. Rest your brains. Have an argument with somebody. Go and get a cup of coffee, and please. And please give me your forms and dinner money. Do not leave this room without giving me your form, and we'll see you in half an hour. So thank you so much. Thanks, Dan. Fantastic.